This video is a follow-up to the video I did yesterday on historicity versus mythicism, the debate, the eternal debate. It's not really eternal, but it's a growing debate, especially online. Dr. Ehrman, Dr. Carrier are the two main proponents of the respective views, Ehrman for historicism and Carrier for mythicism. Mythicism, basically the idea that Jesus was historical versus Jesus probably was a myth made into a human. I don't think mythicists are absolutist about that. Like Carrier is not, he's not saying that's absolutely true. He's saying that there's good reason to think that Jesus might have been a myth. So this video is going to be talking about contradictions in the Gospels, and I'm especially going to get into, this is with ChatGPT, I'm going to especially get into what are the most glaring contradictions that you cannot really overlook, right? So first I asked ChatGPT to do a kind of a lighthearted retelling of Jesus' story based on the four Gospels, but bringing in the contradictions. So it brings in the nativity, Matthew and Luke nativity contradictions. There's almost nothing about Jesus as a teenager. Baptism, Matthew, Mark, and Luke all say John baptizes Jesus. A dove appears and God says, "This is my beloved son." But in John's gospel, that's Matthew, Mark, and Luke. I hope I didn't say John. So in John's gospel, the baptism scene is not there at all. John the Baptist sees Jesus, says, "Behold the Lamb of God." He doesn't dunk him. So Jesus, that gets rid of this whole thing about John being potentially greater than Jesus, perhaps, right? Did John baptize Jesus or not? Depends on which gospel you read. Jesus assembles the squad, gathers the 12 disciples. Let's see. There's probably contradictions there, but let's not talk about that right now. The miracles. Did Jesus cleanse the temple at the start of his ministry in John, or near the end, the other gospels? Right. So in John, Jesus cleanses the temple, overturns the tables at the beginning of John's gospel, at the beginning of his ministry, versus the other gospels. Triumphal entry and Last Supper. Matthew says that Jesus rides two animals at once. Is it one donkey or two? That's definitely seeming contradiction. I'm not getting too much into details. Some of you know what I'm talking about. Others might need to get more of the details. This is not a introductory discussion, but trials and crucifixion. Jesus is arrested, tried, and crucified. In Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they have him largely silent before Pilate. In John, he's giving confident theological TED Talks. My kingdom is not of this world. Contradiction alert number 5. What were Jesus' last words? In Matthew and Mark, he says, my God, why have you forsaken me?" In Luke, he says, "Father, into your hands I commend my spirit," which suggests that he did not suffer. In Luke, it suggests that he was not suffering and did not have undergo a passion, versus in Matthew and Mark, it suggests that he was suffering. He was undergoing this passion. In John, he says, "It is finished." Resurrection. The tomb is empty, but who goes to the tomb and when? In Matthew, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary go. In Mark, the same, but ends abruptly with everyone too afraid to say anything. Luke, a whole group of women and two angelic men. John, Mary Magdalene alone, who mistakes the risen Jesus for a gardener. Who saw Jesus first? Depends. Either a group of women, just Mary, or nobody said anything at all. Either way, he's back. Final thoughts. All right, then what I did was I asked ChatGPT to get into. I said, all right, now, because that was lighthearted, and this is, then I said, more on a more serious note, let's talk about the most glaring contradictions that you cannot overlook, right? So then it says the genealogy in Matthew and Luke are different. You can't, that's not something you can easily overlook or reconcile. The timing of Jesus' crucifixion in Mark, Jesus is crucified the 3rd hour. In John, Jesus is still on trial with Pilate at the 6th hour. Why does it matter? John may have deliberately shifted the timing to align Jesus' death with the slaughter of the Passover lamb, symbolism over chronology. That hints at theological editing, not eyewitness reporting. Right? So there was perhaps a theological agenda, which, begs the question of maybe it was all a theological agenda. Maybe this was all a made-up story that got changed, altered, based on what any given gospel writer wanted to prioritize, right? What did they want to really get across to their people? The resurrection accounts, who saw what, when, and where. Matthew, who goes to the tomb. They all have different accounts. There's different accounts in every single gospel. I'm not going to go into all the details. The number and identity of women differ. Number and identity of angelic beings differ. Who actually saw Jesus first differs. In Mark's earliest version, no one tells anyone anything, and there's no resurrection appearance at all. And especially, that's interesting, especially if Mark is the first gospel, which most scholars agree that that Mark's gospel is the first gospel. The resurrection is the core claim of Christianity. Contradictions here aren't about trivial details, they're about the foundational event. Jesus' last words on the cross, I already talked about that. It's different. Matthew and Mark have him saying, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Which I believe is Psalm 22 or something. It's the beginning of that psalm. Luke has him say, "Father, into your hands I commend my spirit," which I believe is also a psalm. And John has him say, "It is finished." That also could be somewhere in the Old Testament, right? We have to look, or based on something in the Old Testament. These are all incompatible. Each gospel is making a theological point, not just recording history. Jesus' first public appearance, where and doing what? In John, Jesus' first public miracle is turning water into wine at Cana. In Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Jesus' first major public act is preaching, followed by casting out demons or calling disciples. Problem, in John, Jesus never even casts out a demon, not once. This is interesting. In the Synoptics, it's one of his main activities. That's very interesting. It suggests very different versions of Jesus' public image and mission depending on which gospel you read. Remember that the Synoptic Gospels are all very similar. John's is the most different gospel. John's is the most theological of the Gospels. You might say Christological of the Gospels. How did Judas die? Matthew, Judas hangs himself. In Acts, Judas fell into a field, burst open, and his guts spilled out. These cannot both literally be true. Where did the disciples first see the risen Jesus? In Matthew, Jesus meets the disciples in Galilee. In Luke 24 and Acts, Jesus appears to the disciples in Jerusalem and tells them to stay there. Problem, the disciples can't both leave immediately for Galilee and stay put in Jerusalem. Why it matters, the location of the first post-resurrection appearance changes the narrative climax and setting of early Christian authority. Summary. This ChatGPT summary now. Why these contradictions matter. These aren't trivial mistakes like forgetting what Jesus had for breakfast. They raised deep questions about historical reliability, eyewitness testimony versus literary theology, early Christian diversity, the development of doctrine. It suggests that the Gospels are not neutral biographies, but crafted theological portraits, each with its own agenda, audience, and interpretation of events. All right, that's that. And then I tried to bring this into the current present tense moment, the tense present moment that we're in, with what's happening in the world of politics, and definitely want to, in Matthew, Jesus says, I come not to bring peace but the sword, which is kind of like, you kind of do like a double take when you read that. You're like, what? Jesus comes to bring, divide people, right? What is he talking about? And I think the meaning of it there is that Jesus's message is going to divide people, that there will be some that reject him and some that accept him. Not everyone's going to accept him. Some will reject him. Now, we see a very similar thing, and I also have said in the past that if you really look closely at the Gospels, Jesus does